So I am a co-founder at a company called Ozone API. We provide great standards-based API technology to banks. And I've also, as Chris said, been playing a role at the open banking implementation entity in the UK, where I've been leading ecosystem development. So quite a privileged position, sort of at the heart of the ecosystem, seeing the growth, seeing the use cases come about. Yeah, an interesting question. So I think since the COVID crisis, we've seen a huge sort of surge in innovation, actually. So I think we've seen a whole bunch of really interesting use cases focused on helping people confirm their eligibility for these different grants, for access to some of the lending, the lending options and funds that are out there at the minute. A whole series around sort of financial well-being. There's a bunch of use cases that have started to come to the fore in the wake of the COVID crisis. Payments has been in there as well. So I think we've seen pretty simple ones actually, but there've been quite a few use cases, particularly around charity donations. Obviously, charities are losing a huge amount of opportunity to raise funds with big events like marathons and the likes being cancelled. But what we've seen, the most high profile was obviously, for those in the UK, Captain Tom. And Just Giving, as part of the Captain Tom fundraising page, also included open banking as a payment option. One of many payment use cases out there, but I think it was a really good and very visible use of open banking and was very successful. Is this creating a huge surge? I guess I've got a couple of thoughts. So I think what we're seeing with COVID is a real sort of a bounce or injection in innovation around a cause, which is great. I think at the same time, there's challenges for the industry. So access to VC funding and things like that is tough. Long term, for payments to really, really take off, I think one of the things that we need to do is get beyond just the regulatory foundations that have been built to date. So the banks and the ecosystem move beyond that to probably a more commercial foundation that sits on top of that regulatory minimum. And I think that will really open the scale. So has COVID been the catalyst that will drive significant long-term adoption? Well, it probably needs other things, but has it been a really interesting and useful boost in innovation in the short term? I think it really has, yeah. Brazil, just a week and a half ago, the central bank, I thought very interestingly, in the context of COVID and central banks being under a lot of pressure to focus on economic recovery and all of these things, went full steam ahead with rolling out the open banking legislation. I thought that was a really bold and brave move, recognition that a good digital economy is a real asset at this point. They, I think, looking and taking a lot of learnings from the markets in the UK and Europe. So it'll be a much broader scope than the UK. So all financial services product types, not just current accounts and payment accounts, with concepts of reciprocity to drive a more open and commercial market. So I think we'll see the market grow differently. And what we see, if you look at, again, places like India, okay, it isn't called open banking in the same way, but the UPI model, I mean, that's 4 years old now. We're seeing over 1 billion transactions a month pretty consistently. It's got through some of those first implementation hurdles. There's some common standards being applied. There's some real big demand players with some great use cases and great user experience. And we're seeing there the volumes fly. So I think there's some certain characteristics that have made the UK a little bit unique in Europe. But I think there's a next stage, which is now that sort of commercial layer that will really unlock a lot more potential. It's important to understand we are still at the kind of end of the beginning, and the benchmark to date has been what has the regulation asked for. So a lot of the APIs are delivered to meet those minimum requirements. Now, I think as a much more commercial market starts to build on top of those APIs, as banks start to create more functionally rich APIs to enable, as Todd was saying, the variable recurring payments, which is one of the things we've been working on developing at OBIE. identity-based propositions, more options around that authentication user experience. It doesn't have to always go back to the bank, and put a commercial framework around that. I think we'll then see the economics and the demands of the demand side drive a significant uptick then in terms of the availability and the performance and the functionality of the bank APIs. So I think harmonization of standards is certainly a goal, and driving that interoperability, we know in a payments industry is really critical. Actually, if you break down the sort of anatomy of standards, in certain areas, I think that harmonization is starting to happen. So at the security layer, so how consent management works and how the connectivity between banks and third parties, actually a lot of the standards now are using exactly the same base foundation, which is the OpenID Foundation's FAPI standard. So FDX has that as the baseline. The UK Open Banking Standard has that as the baseline. I think a number of other standards that don't have that level of security model will move to it. So we're starting to see harmonization there. I think what we'll see at the functional level, so what products are available, the data sets and things like that, we might see a little bit more fragmentation before we see harmonization, because again, Brazil, for example, if their scope is including pensions, mortgages, investment products and things before, say, the UK is, that it'll need to expand to cover those different data sets. But I think then you get a library that can be pieced together. So if you have a common set of security protocols for connectivity between parties and for consent management, then you might have some different functional libraries between markets. I think you start to move towards harmonization. And for me, it's that consent and connectivity layer where the harmonization is most important. And we're seeing that with the great work that the OpenID Foundation and others are doing. So I think it's a better situation than a lot of commentators and people suggest. But the fragmentation is certainly still a barrier. There's more to do for the industry to really make sure that we get interoperability. What we'll see here is just a recognition of the importance of a great digital API-based platform. Interesting, I think this is about, so we tend to talk about data or payments, or I think what we've got, there's now been an investment in delivering a secure API layer with a common consent approach, which banks can then leverage to make services available. I think this is the moment that Amazon had in 2002 when they had their API mandate. Everything we do must be consumable from the outside. So I think this is an opportunity for banks to deliver great APIs with a common sort of consent model that can be used as a platform for whether it's payments, whether it's onboarding to a loyalty scheme, whether it's booking a flight, whatever it is, that potential to start combining some information about me with some identity attributes about me and then the money as a result. It's not going to happen immediately. Again, this is going to need to evolve a little over time. But I think this situation now, as we've talked about with video conferencing and things, it's accelerating the importance of a great digital infrastructure. Banks have already invested in that. They can just do it across more products and with richer functionality. And if they do that well, I think this is a huge, huge opportunity for both the banks and the banking industry, but every other business that can build on top of that and build great end customer propositions around that access. So I'm hoping it will be a continued acceleration, as Todd said. I think we'll just see the numbers ramp. I mean, interesting, we've been talking in the UK a lot to some of the various different government departments, and they've got loads of challenges at the moment. They're going to have to reduce costs significantly. They're having to find more digital ways of dealing with new customers, whether they're onboarding to universal credit or these different schemes. That infrastructure is there. Actually, there's a great opportunity for the nation, for industry to grab hold of this and accelerate the pace of it. And I think we'll see that.